So I'm Gerda Shank, and this presentation is on HTML FormHandler, which is my Perl form package for displaying HTML forms. This is a quote from MST. He said, "FormHandler is the least horrible form option," which I'm supposed to take as high praise because forms are really seem to be a lot more complicated and a lot more sucky than they ought to be. When you first look at them, it seems like they're pretty simple, but the more you explore and the more things you want to do with them, the more complicated they get. They interface with the user, gathering information from the person who's entering it, and it's a meeting point of the model, view, and controller in your web application. So there's a lot of boundaries there that are hard to control well. A lot of controller activities ends up being in form interfaces. There's also some disagreement on how much a form package should actually do. Some people prefer lighter weight things so that they have to write more code themselves, and other people prefer more powerful packages that do more for you. I don't think you're ever going to find anybody that totally agrees on which way to go. FormHandler has kind of pretty much gone in the direction of complexity. There's actually quite a few features in it right now, and it can take a while to learn all of the features and read the documentation. Forms are really kind of they're not very clean MVC in the controller. They have parts of the model, which is the database, parts of the view, which is the rendering, and then the central form class is kind of like a controller piece. So if the form is just being executed in a test case or a script, that could be considered fairly pure MVC. But then when you go and drop it in the controller, then you have this sort of this object that's a mixture of these different sorts of aspects in one place. So the way I like to think about it is that MVC isn't like just pure and simple like silos, view, controller, and model, but there's some sort of fractal aspect to it, so that the form is kind of a little bit of a fractal MVC object of itself that's embedded in the controller. I did consider separating out the rendering to get the view a little more clean, because that part is kind of mixed in. There's the validation and the rendering definitions are all kind of mixed in. But one of the things that I kind of like about the way FormHandler works is that you can have a continuum of like doing all your rendering practically in a template, or doing almost all of it automatically, and there's steps in between. And if I separated out the rendering in a more clean way architecturally, then it would be a little harder to have that sort of flexibility. It seems like it also might add some complexity without improving the usability. FormHandler history. This FormHandler has its roots in almost 5 years ago. I was hired to convert a CGI Perl application into a more modern Perl application. So I picked Catalyst and DBIX class, but I wasn't satisfied with the form choices that were available at the time. I had a kind of an idea in my head of how I would like it to work, and they didn't seem to work that way. So I found Form Processor, and I liked its architecture, so I spent some time trying to figure out how to use it. The documentation wasn't really clear on that point. So I started using it, but then I started using Moose, and Form Processor used Rose Object as an object model, and I didn't really want to have two different sorts of object models in my application. So I thought, well, I can convert Form Processor to Moose, which was actually fairly straightforward because Rose Object wasn't in some way all that different. So I did a conversion, but the person who was maintaining Form Processor really didn't have time to put into it. So I released the first FormHandler version in January 2009. Put the source code on GitHub and started an IRC channel, and I tried to have as complete documentation as I could, because my experience with learning the previous package was that if it's not documented so people can use it, you might as well not have the features there. So it was pretty minimal to start with, and of course it's a lot bigger now. In May of 2009, I added repeatable elements, so you could have arrays of fields that map to has many columns in the database. And in August, I re-architected it to get the data a little more cleanly separated, so that there wasn't so much state stored in the form, and you could reuse it if you wanted to. Originally, the rendering wasn't all that great. I tended to use templates myself, but people wanted to have the automatic rendering, so I provided it. But earlier this year, I redid a lot of the rendering code to support rendering Twitter Bootstrap HTML, so that you can use that CSS framework. And so it's changed quite a lot recently, and that version was released in March of this year. I'm going to go over the basics of using FormHandler. How many people here have never used FormHandler? Oh, so a lot of you, right? So the fields are defined declaratively in a form class mostly. I mean, there are other ways that you can create fields, and a form object should have all of its fields created when it's built. Some other form packages, you create the object and then you add the fields afterwards. That's not the way it works with FormHandler. It uses Moose, so there's almost all of the attributes in the data in the form are using Moose attributes. So it provides a lot of power and a lot of flexibility as far as overriding the behavior or doing, changing how things work. But it does have some overhead. There's a DBIC model which will automatically interface with your DBIX result sources, so that if the field names match your DBIC result source column names, then it will automatically update the database. And the rendering can be done automatically, completely, with the built-in widgets and rendering code, or else you can use templates. There's also repeatable fields, which are array sort of structures, and compound fields, which are like the equivalent of a hash ref or a single related table. A form package is a typical Perl package. You have to use HTML form handler Moose, which is in order to get the sugar for like the has field and a couple of other sugar terms that are used, and you have to extend HTML form handler. So and then you can declare your fields with has field. Like this is a real simple form. It has 3 fields. One of them which is just a submit button, one which is a select element, and one which is a name, which would be a plain text field. It's not doing any particular validation. That would be put in with other code. The form is created with new, and then you call process on it with the params that have been passed in on the post, if any. And normally if the params are empty, it's assumed that it was not a post. But you can also put in a flag to indicate that directly. And if this is a non-database form, afterwards the process parameters are available in a structure that you can get out by doing form value. A database form is very similar to the non-database form, but it uses it extends the HTML form handler model DBIC instead of just the plain HTML form handler. In this case, you also have an item class that gives the name of your DBIC result source, and it's not absolutely necessary, but it's kind of nice to do that. You need to provide it if you don't pass in a whole role. So this could map to a table that had a street column, a city column, and then of course the submit button. The database form is processed in the same way as the non-database form, except you pass in the row, of course. So the item is the DBIC row that you've retrieved somehow, probably from a primary key. At its simplest form, you can render the form by just doing form render, or you can render an individual field by doing form, field, name, and render that. There's a lot more complication to rendering. I'll go through a little bit more of it later, but that's the absolute basics. There's a lot of attributes in the field so that you can define various behaviors and or pieces of data or rendering settings. All fields have to have a name and a type. If you don't provide a type, it's assumed to be text. The accessor attribute is for if you want your name of your field to be different than what your DBIX result source accessor is. For default is one way to provide the default value for the field. So when it's displayed to the user initially, it will have some value in it if you don't have a row usually. The ID is the ID that's rendered in the HTML. So there's actually a real lot of different field attributes. This is just a list of some of them. You can set the messages. You can set a required flag. You can provide a bunch of other rendering settings. There's also you can set some methods in the field definitions. This is to start with. A lot of these things could be done by applying a role, but that was kind of a little bit awkward in some ways, and you didn't necessarily see the code. So more of the features have been provided by allowing you to set code refs for it. So this is some of the code refs that you can set on a particular field. You can provide some code to set the defaults, to validate the field, to localize it, inflate, deflate it in a couple of different ways, build an ID that's different than the standard, or provide different sorts of ways of building and displaying the labels. The forms can be organized in lots of different ways. The basic thing is a form class. You always will have something in the form class. You can, in theory, also pass in fields on new, but it's harder to test. So I don't, for some sorts of small fast forms, that's probably fine. But usually a form class is more common. You can also build your own field classes. FormHandler provides quite a few fields, probably too many. If I was going to do it like over again, I would probably leave a lot of them out. But you can also build your own field classes and provide specialized validation, or put in any Moose attributes that you want to, that you would set in the has field definitions. Compound field classes are like the regular field definitions, except they also contain fields. So you could have a compound field that has, like you could have an addresses compound field that had an addresses dot name, or addresses dot street, or an addresses dot city, and you can define those sorts of compound fields in a separate class, just like the regular fields. You use the custom fields in a form by setting the field namespace, and then setting the type to the short name of the field. Like this particular form uses the two example custom fields that I showed in the earlier slides. So you just set the type, and it will load in a field of that kind. You can also create field definitions in a role. You have to use, instead of HTML FormHandler Moose, you have to use HTML FormHandler Moose role, and then you can just define the fields just like you did in a class. The advantage of that is that you can then use that set of fields in either a form or a compound field. So like, for example, if you want to have an address, or a form and an address compound field, you could define the fields in one place and pull them in two different classes. You can also build, this is the alternative to using the has field sugar. You can build fields with a subroutine in your class, so that if you want to build a different list of fields, depending on some piece of information that's passed in, you can provide it with a method. So this example shows that you have some sort of flag that you've set in your form, and you've passed in a value when you created it, and it will build a different sort of list of fields depending. You can also have a bunch of fields in your form and only turn some of them on or off. Either set some in active, or have them all set to inactive and set some active, or have them all set to active and set some inactive, whichever is most convenient. So, for example, this first one, they might have like four other fields that are inactive, and you pass in the list of the name of the fields that you want to actually work with this time. so that you can use the same form for different circumstances. This is a more recent feature. It's from a project that I had to do recently. It had almost 500 fields in one compound field, and just the build time alone was kind of high. So this is a feature where instead of building all of those fields and setting them inactive, you set an include attribute with the build include method, which tells it which fields to actually build, and it won't build any fields except those. And you can also pass fields on, and this is what I mentioned before. This is what I'd call a dynamic form. So you don't have a subclass of HTML form handler. You're just passing in a list of field definitions. Any questions about that part? No. Okay, this is validation. There's a lot of different ways to validate. There's a couple of different flavors. There are some field attributes that perform validations. You can also set some field methods, and then you can use apply actions, which are some built-in structure for supplying validations. There are also a few form methods that you can use to validate. The required attribute is probably one of the most common. You set that on a field. Well, that should say required equals 1, although 2 probably works too. And you can also set the messages. The message for that. This is how you set messages for the built-in validation. There's a key that you use, and you can change the message to be whatever you want it to be. And required when is an additional attribute that says that this field is only required when this particular condition is true. And this one is where when the FI field is set to 2, then this field is required. There's a unique flag to check for unique. This actually only currently works for the base level of the form fields. It doesn't work for nested fields yet. Because that gets a little complicated, but it should be sometime in the future. There's range start and range end, which is for usually for integer ranges. There's some built-in fields that use that one. And some of the subclasses of the fields have their own validation attributes. Like text fields, you can set min length and max length, and date fields, you can set date start and date end, and upload fields, min size and max size. And of course, if you create your own fields, you could set other attributes and use those to validate if you wanted to. This is the field validation methods. If you've defined a field foo, you can set a validation method, with a code ref with validate method, and this will be a method on the form on the field itself, and then you can also use, without having to declare it, you can create a validate underscore and then the field name, and that will automatically be used to validate your field. That would be a method in the form, and do whatever checking you want to on the values, of course. There's also a validate method in the form itself, and this is where cross-validation or validation that needs access to more than one field happens. So if you have some complex logic, if this field is this and that field is that, then this, you'd probably do it in a validate routine in the form itself. And you can make custom fields with custom validation, of course. They also have apply actions. Now, this is the other main category of validation. You use the apply keyword and the field definition, and you can and it points to an array of validators, and these validators can be either moose types or a hash ref with one of 3 keys: check, transform, or type. In the first one here, the foo, that pos integer, that would be a moose type, and so that will validate that the value of that field is a positive integer, and will issue an error message, add an error to the form if it isn't. The check validation key value can be a string, a code ref, or an array ref. The array ref checks to make sure that the value of that field is one of the values in the array. A transform is basically another way of doing a transformation on the value if you're switching from one format to another or something like that. The type key value is a moose type, and that's mainly so that if you want to change the message that's provided with the moose type, you can use the type but issue a different message. And these hash refs that have the check, transform, and type keys in them can also have a message key where you set the message, which can be either a string, an array ref, like for locale make text, or a code ref, so that you can do more complex generation of the message. There's also a when key, which will this particular validation will only happen when another field is set to a particular value. HTML Form Handler provides a library of types that can be used for validation. It's just kind of a collection of some standard ones. You can create your own, of course, or you can create a type constraint in the form. This is an example of doing that, creating a greater than 10 constraint and using it in the apply. Any questions on validation? Yes?
Yeah, I have a good question. You're talking about HTML forms.
Right.
Okay, so then this validation occurs when the data is submitted,
Correct. When the form is submitted. Yes. She asked if this validation happened when the form is submitted, and yes, that's correct. The data is submitted, and whatever your web application is will get the parameters from the request in some way, and the parameters are passed into HTML Form Handler, and those parameters are validated according to the definitions and the validations that you've set up in your form. Any other questions? Okay, rendering. There's a continuum of how you can render that goes from totally automatic, just basically doing form render, all the way to rendering almost completely with templates. And you can like phase things in so that you're rendering less and less or more and more, depending on what your needs are. The rendering is implemented as roles that are applied to the fields and of course to the form too. The widget is a role that has a render method in it, which renders just the form element, the one like either the input or the select or the whatever the form element is for that particular field. The widget wrapper is a role with a wrap field, a method which wraps HTML around the form element, and also renders additional bits like things that are set with other of the rendering settings, like after element. You could put a string or a piece of HTML in there. And which kind of rendering is the best for your situation depends on a lot of different things, like how do you work with the front-end developers, how much do you have to provide them, how much control they have. Is the HTML that's generated, is it good enough for what you're doing, or does it fit your purposes? Or is it worth it to put time into developing customized widgets or themes or other sorts of code, or would it be simpler to just put the HTML out there and connect it up? Is the form so complex that doing it in templates means lots of logic? And of course, do you prefer writing Perl or template code? Some people really like complicated templates, and some people would prefer to put that in Perl. So you kind of have a choice. This is an example of a form that is rendered almost completely in a template. The only things that come from Form Handler actually are somehow you want to fill in the values of the fields, and Form Handler provides a FIF, or for fill in form hash ref, which you can use to fill in the values. And so the only thing that's coming from Form Handler here are the FIF.foo and FIF.bar values. I mean, you could do that in some other way too if you wanted. So this form would work fine with FormHandler as long as the names of the elements were matched the names of the fields in your FormHandler form. You can also render each form individually. This shows you've done the form tags and closing form tag yourself, but you're rendering each field using the FormHandler form that's been set in the stash. You can also just render the form element without any wrapping code. You can either set a widget wrapper to none, so that there is no wrapping, or else use the render element method instead. And then you can do all the wrapping code yourself, like put a div around each element or whatever you want to. And of course, the simplest way is just to do form.render, which works and you can do a lot to customize how it's displayed too. There's a lot of tags and settings, and you can set the classes and the tags for the wrappers and things like that. The default wrapping code is the default rendering code is HTML FormHandler widget form simple. That's the one that's supplied unless you tell it differently. And if you want to use a different form rendering role, you use the moose with and include the role name. And you can change the wrapper for all of your fields by setting widget wrapper. This is an example of using a table renderer instead of the standard renderer, and the widget wrapper is set to table so that each element will be put into a table row. This is some of the attributes and things that you can use to control rendering in the form. Widget wrapper, form wrapper, whether or not you want to have a form wrapper or not. Form tags, that's the settings that are passed to the rendering code to do different things. What you want the element at the form element attributes, like if you want, I'm not sure what you'd put in a form. My mind is kind of gone blank. But you can put a class string into the form tag. So if you want this form to have different classes on it, and the same thing for the wrapper. Or you can also set the wrapper tag to be something. The standard is a div, and you can also set it to be a field set or some other sort of HTML tag. Each field has a lot of settings for rendering also. You can also set widget and widget wrapper and set tags that are passed to the renderers, and set whether you want a wrapper or not, or whether you want a label or not, what the attributes on the element are. Like you can set a placeholder or a title or a number of other arbitrary attributes. And you can also set classes, so you could have a number of classes on your HTML elements. And the same things apply for the wrapper that's created and the label. Now, normally, the standard way of rendering is it goes through the list of fields that you've defined in your form, and it renders them in order, or you can provide an order number. But that's kind of like just straight through, and sometimes you want to have a more complicated organization, like have a certain number of fields in a field set, or some others and set off in some other way. So you so if you want to have a different sort of rendering layout, then you can use a block, which is kind of declared in a similar way to the field. You can say, like this is an example of declaring a block where it says has block and first FS like field set, and it says I want this block to be a field set, and the label on it, which would be for the case of a field set, would be the legend, would be 2 fields, and in this block I want to render those 2 fields, foo and bar. And then and then you have to tell the form that you want to render by blocks by giving it a render list, which is on the bottom line here, build render list, and it says render just the field set and then the submit button, and then the rendering code in the widget will render it like that. So you can set up some pretty complex some different rendering, or if you have a really customized like element that you do a lot, you can create a block or a widget, whichever is appropriate, and then just set it in your fields. Now, the Twitter Bootstrap rendering is a different wrapper, HTML form handler, widget wrapper, Bootstrap, and it produces the standard Bootstrap style HTML like they use for the horizontal and the vertical forms. And this is an example of what the standard Bootstrap HTML looks like. And let me see if I can show you what this looks like. Okay, this is an example that's on GitHub that shows using FormHandler forms, and it compares it to the top one here is rendered entirely with HTML. It was originally copied from the Bootstrap example, and the next example, and these all should look the same, is but if you look at the actual application, you can see how it's done differently. And this is done with by the form elements are rendered with FormHandler, but all the other wrapping code and the extra labels are done in the template. And this final form here is rendered with the Bootstrap wrapper entirely by definitions in FormHandler. And it looks pretty much, it should look exactly the same as the other ones. So you do end up getting a lot more settings and complication in the form code. So depending on what your needs are, that might or might not be a good thing. You can create your own rendering widgets. If you have a particular way to render a field that you use a lot, you just create a little role, just like one of the widgets that we already have, and you can set the widget namespace in the form and or on the field, and you can specify the widget and the widget wrapper and the block. So you could create entire libraries of rendering code that to produce exactly the results that you want. Any questions about rendering? No. Okay. This next topic is code hooks. One of the things that I try very hard to do is to allow the behavior to be overridden or to be modified or to be changed so that you can do anything you want to. So there's a lot of places where you can hook into the code and the process, but in order to do that properly, you kind of have to have some idea of what the flow of control is. So this is just a real brief look at the places you might want to change behavior. Probably for people who haven't used it before, it might be a little over their heads, but anyway. The fields are always built on new in the FormHandler build method, which is a moose thing. So that if you wait until after new, you can't add a field. So if you want to do something before the fields are built, you have to do it before that happens in the build call. And the results are the objects which are created to hold the input parameters and the values that are developed from the defaults or initial object in the validation. And those are built in setup form. And they're only built for the fields that are going to be used on this particular process call. So if you have fields that are inactive or otherwise not being used, then they won't be in the results. So you have to be aware of where the results are built if you want to do things that involve accessing of fields, because otherwise some of the information won't be there. And the values are set during the validation process. So if you directly set a value on a field, then you might be surprised because it'll be overwritten during the validation. So you have to be aware of when that's happening so that if you want to change the value, you're not changing it in a place that's not going to work. The result objects that are created in setup forms, there's 3 paths for creating them depending on what's happening. If params have been passed in, the form has been posted, they're created from the input params. if there are no params, then and there's an item or an initial object, it creates the values. It uses the values from that initial object, which is either a role or a set of or a hash ref usually that has some initial settings. If there are none of that, then if there's not an item or initial object, then it uses the field definitions, which may have defaults in it. So depending on what you're exactly doing, the values will come from different places. There are some flags that will change that order a little bit, because sometimes you want to pass in an empty row to the item, but you still want to provide defaults in a different place. So there are some flags that you can set to change that a little bit. But that's and there are some more complex situations where it might start building from one type of a path and switch to the other. Like if you have disabled fields, you can get them fine from the initial item, but they won't be posted back. So you need to get the values from the code goes and gets the values from someplace else. So the places that you normally would want to override or change the behavior are this is a list of some of the places. Like in the build, there are method calls that are there explicitly to allow hooking, so for you to do extra things, and those are the before build and after build methods. And then process is what you call every time the form is processed. And it's a method that has basically it's just a list of other method calls. And depending on what you're doing, you may want to override or hook into some of these. Like clear setup form is where the results are built. And validate form is where the validation is performed. And update model is, if you have a database form, is where the database is updated. In the setup form, set active is where the fields are switched to active or inactive, depending on what you've passed in. In update fields, processes changes to the fields that you've passed in. And for using these hooks, you would normally use Moose method modifiers before, after, and around. And I probably should have some examples of what you might want to do, but usually it would be like you have if you have say you only want a field to be required in particular circumstances, you might want to do a after set active or something like that, and change the field to be required or not required. One of the most common ways of overriding the behavior is by handling some parts of database updates yourself or entirely. This is kind of an example of an update model method in the form itself. You wanted to save some history for the updates, and this refers to a save history method, which I'm not displaying here. And then the next method calls the FormHandler update method, which handles the usual updates, and then afterwards there's an object that also does some updates. If you didn't do the next method, you could do the database updates entirely yourself if you want to. Sometimes the database updates are handled by DBIX class result set recursive updates, and there are some situations that it doesn't handle really well, and or sometimes you've displayed the fields in a way that doesn't match the database, and so sometimes you need to do the updates yourself. Now, testing. It's one of the advantages of FormHandler is it's very easy to test your forms because all the behavior is contained within a form class. So you don't have the problem of testing in the controller or in the web application. You can test very easily in a script. Like this is, for example, a test. A test that just using test more that just creates the form class, processes it first empty, and then provides some parameters such as would have come from a post, and then it just checks to make sure that it's validated. Now, obviously, you can put in a lot more logic than this if you want to. If you have complicated validations or different sets of parameters, you can test them very easily in a test case, and that makes it a lot easier to just drop it into the controller without worrying that it's going to behave properly. Now, in March, that was when I released the last really big update, which is with lots of rendering changes. And so this is just a list of kind of minor features that have happened since then, which is, I guess, the last 3 months. I added the required when attribute, the Bootstrap input append button, a new multiple field select CSV, which does a multiple select from a value that's passed in that has comma delimited, comma separated values, and takes the comma separated values and expands them into an array, and then when it creates the value, the final value, it joins them back up again. Also allows you to set some sort options for if you want to sort your multiple select, so that the ones that are selected at the top. Added the when clause for apply actions, so that you can say only apply this validation if another field has a particular value. I refactored the radio group widget to allow individually rendered options, which was something that I wanted to not have them all in a row, but have them in different places. And supported option groups and select radio group and checkbox group widgets. Refactored the widget so that you can render the element without having to set the widget wrapper to none. Handled disabled fields better. Added a build label method, and that's for people that want to have a label that's not just a string, that they want to build it based on some other information. Implemented that experimental include list for form compound fields, and added by type to update subfields. Update subfields is a way to package up a bunch of updates for the fields, particularly the rendering stuff, so that you can put the rendering information in a separate role if you want to keep that separate from your form. And added a block list to provide blocks in a non-editable field. Okay, this is about a complex form example that I did recently at work. It had the table had, well, there was 2 tables. One had probably, I don't know, maybe 30 some columns in the end, and it points to another related table that has 500 columns in it. And we needed a set of forms so that each base object would have forms that had included 2 rows from the related table and displayed information from 2 other rows, and the set of forms had to be able to move the fields around easily, so that somebody said, "Well, I want this field here and I want this in a different form." It wasn't really tedious to update, and I also had to be able to display the data on like an overview page in the same organization as it was in the forms. So this was done with, I did this with one base form class, one compound field that contained more than 450 fields, one role that contained, I don't know, maybe 20, 50 fields, and one class which defined the organization of all of the fields. It included like tabs, sections, and subsections, and another file that had a large struct with all the informations about all the columns, and each section in the structured information was a separate form. So from this information, there was 25 separate forms are displayed, and each subsection was a separate table section. And the base form class reads the list of columns that are in this particular form from the structured file. It builds an include list to only build those fields from those very large those fields with 450 fields in those. So and then created a custom block to render the table with 6 columns for each row. There was also another additional custom object which contained separate suppression flags for each row in the table for the forms. The update model code actually updated the 2 rows automatically, and that part worked very well, but there was some additional code to update the suppression object and the edit history. 2 levels of menu tabs that were displayed were built by a menu object from the same structured data. Let me see if I can I'll show you how that looked. This doesn't display very well on this particular screen because the resolution is too small and it's really built for a wider thing. But this particular set of forms, there's 25 forms that are all built off of those, like about 6 different files. Questions? Yes.
Yeah, is there anything about your system that prevents people from loading a whole lot of JavaScript with the form and then doing dynamic things?
Well, dynamic JavaScript happens in the browser, on the front end. So FormHandler doesn't do anything explicitly with it. You would have to set your JavaScript up yourself. I mean, I know there are some form packages that have a tighter integration with that, but I haven't done anything with that yet.
You wrote your own JavaScript and then you did validation and various maybe enabled, disabled fields in there based on various users. That wouldn't necessarily collide with what you
No, it should have no problem. Yeah, it'll take the values that are submitted are all that FormHandler cares about. I mean, it doesn't know how it got there. So, any other questions? There are some other things I could talk about. I don't know if I've kind of run out of the part that I had actually scripted. I can discuss defaults or errors or inflation, deflation if anybody's interested in those topics. Deathly silence. Any other questions? No. Okay. Well, that's it then.